In fact, kelp beds are known as the sequoia of the seas. They're lush, they're impressive. They're as impressive as the towering redwoods are. And they dominated nearshore waters off the eastern coast of North America. And you've mentioned the decline over the last number of years. The decline, I think, is most severe in California. So California has actually lost 96% of its kelp forest just within the last 10 years. And I'll talk about how that originated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm your host as we discuss our vanishing underwater forests. And what do we mean when we say underwater forests? Well, these are comprised of 4 ecosystems, 4 key habitats, and they include kelp forests, mangroves, seagrass meadows, and coral reefs. And of course, you've heard us speaking about coral reefs a few times on this show. Their importance to the ocean, to those who live in the ocean, and of course, to human beings who make a living off of the beauty of the coral reefs and the tourism that these coral reefs draw to them. There are many other things that are also important about coral reefs, and we'll get into some of that as well. One of the things I want to do is just break down these 4 different habitats. And I want to also say that, like, the loss of these systems, of course, would be a horrible disaster for the ocean and for those living beings who depend on these habitats. But it would also be terrible for humanity. And of course, a lot of us are interested in the prospering of humanity. It would be very, very bad for us because there are many human communities that rely on these underwater forests for food and for jobs. And also, these habitats help decrease the speeding up of climate change by drawing down those carbon emissions. They can also help with storms and making them less severe in low-lying areas and people who live near these areas. Now, kelp, what is kelp? It's a habitat. It supports coastal fisheries. Maybe you've seen kelp. It's these big, long streams of plants. They look like vines, actually. And a lot of fish and sea mammals live in these kelp forests. They definitely help to suck up the carbon from the atmosphere, and they help to buffer against ocean acidification. Now, among all these wonderful things that kelp does, I must tell you that kelp is in danger, that over the past 50 years, 60% of kelp forests have been degraded. Kelp, it's a cool water species. And so with the warming of the ocean waters, it puts a tremendous amount of stress on kelp forests. Problematically, there's no global legal or policy forces enacted to help kelp. It's very problematic. Now, in addition to kelp, there are mangroves. These are trees and shrubs, and they are along the intertidal edge of the land and the sea. They provide food, building materials for those who live close to the areas, and they are great places for non-human beings to live. In fact, they not only help provide with food and building materials, but they're great spaces for around 2.4 billion people who live near the world's coastlines. They can help reduce the severity of climate-related impacts by helping people in nature adapt to changing conditions. They also help as a defense against storm surges and rising sea levels. Now, I want to talk also about seagrass meadows. These are literally meadows that are on the ocean floor. They're flowering plants, and they are found in sheltered coastal waters. They protect coasts from erosion and they store carbon like the other habitats that I've brought up to you as well. So they do a lot. They do a lot of heavy lifting. And they also provide food security by providing vital nurseries that support the fish population. Now, almost 30% of seagrass has been lost since the 19th century, and at least 22 of the world's 72 seagrass species are in decline. And coral reef, last but not least, is also part of the underwater forest. We've done some shows discussing coral reefs, and we'll attach those links in the description, so I won't go over it too much, considering we've covered that topic on its own. And I'm going to pass it on to Paul, who I think is going to discuss a little more in depth about these various underwater forests, and I think maybe even touch a bit more on kelp. So Paul, without further ado, could you share with us what information you have regarding these habitats?
Yes, thank you, Regina. I was very fortunate in the late 80s to scuba dive off the Channel Islands off the coast of California on these amazing kelp beds. So we went down about 100 feet, and the kelp is anchored to rocks on the bottom, and the plant actually extends all the way up to the surface. There's very huge, almost like palm frond leaves on it. There's little round buoyancy capsules, if you like, that hold air and give the plant support, and it extends all the way up to the forest. And it's almost impenetrable. It's very dark amongst all of the, you're like, it's like you're in a forest. In fact, kelp beds are known as the sequoia of the seas. They're lush, they're impressive. They're as impressive as the towering redwoods are. And they dominated nearshore waters off the eastern coast of North America. And you've mentioned the decline over the last number of years. The decline, I think, is most severe in California. So California has actually lost 96% of its kelp forest just within the last 10 years. And I'll talk about how that originated. But, you've also mentioned how important kelp are. There's more than 1,000 species that live within the kelp forest. They use it for shelter. They use it for nourishment, for food. There's urchins, there's abalone, it's hunting grounds for seals and sea otters. They eat the mollusks. There's gray whales. It's vastly important. It's like the underwater rainforests of the planet in a way. The amount of carbon absorbed by a kelp forest is about 20 times that of a forest on land. So it's a huge carbon capture, carbon sink. So the California reefs really have gone downhill, like I said, in the last decade. It started around 2013. We had this massive marine heat wave off the coast in the eastern Pacific, so western coast, off the west coast of North America. You might have heard of the term, recall the term the blob. We had this massive heat wave that lasted several years. And the problem with this heat wave is that it created conditions for this wasting disease in the starfish. So billions of starfish died, including the apex predator starfish, the sunflower star. The wasting disease basically turned the flesh of these starfish into mush and killed them off. So what that meant is that this predator was no longer able to eat the sea urchins, in particular the purple sea urchin. So the purple sea urchin proliferated in the billions and basically would eat the kelp. It would eat the leaves, it would eat the stalk, it would eat where the kelp was anchored to the seafloor, so the kelp would just float away. And when there was no more food for these purple sea urchins, they basically went into a dormant state on the seafloor, preventing any regrowth possibilities. As soon as there's any nutrients, as soon as kelp tries to anchor itself, it's eaten again by these urchins. So that's basically the chain of events that has completely wiped out 96% of kelp beds off California. Further north and further south along the coast relative to California, there are kelp beds. They weren't decimated to the same extent. I think over the last number of decades, the decline has been. You mentioned 60%. I've seen numbers as high as 82% for the death of this called bull kelp. And kelp is an amazing substance. It's like I call it the bamboo of the oceans as well, because kelp can typically grow about 2 feet per day, capturing huge amounts of carbon. So there is a lot of work being done by various groups to try to restore kelp, because it's such an important part of the ecosystem. And often people overlook kelp and seagrasses and mangroves because the focus these days seems to be on the death of the coral reefs. But I would argue that kelp has suffered worse than coral reefs up to now. Yeah, so it's a big, huge problem.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate your sharing your real-world experience in the kelp forest. It's something that I really hope that I'll get to do sometime in my life. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I also appreciate you just described how everything is connected. So when the starfish became ill and died, the sea urchins went out of control and therefore had a huge feast on the kelp. Everything is connected. And of course, sea otters, which are animals that are near and dear to my heart, are very, very dependent on sea urchins, abalone, and other animals that you had mentioned. And of course, there's so very few of them left. Everything is dependent upon everything else. And guess what? Humans are no exception. We cannot make our way out of the equation of this evolutionary system called life. There's just no way. So we need, even in a selfish way, we need to care about the planet. It is necessary. Life depends on it. Peter, what are your thoughts on these underwater forests?
I also really enjoyed Paul's account and explanation of this huge event. That was really very interesting. I approached this, did a little bit of reading from the point of view of what people are calling blue carbon. There's a lot of discussion out there about blue carbon. Firstly, I want to thanks for bringing up the coral reefs, Regina. So there's a big paper. It's out on a review right now. It's a super paper. And it finds that the tipping point of coral reefs is 1.2 degrees C. And as you know, we have an unprecedented bleaching, destruction. Corals are dying right across tropical zones. That reminded me, though, I thought, I wonder, I seem to remember that the 2007 fourth assessment of the IPCC had a number which really alarmed me at the time. So I went back and had a look. Yeah. So the IPCC back then said coral reefs are very sensitive to temperature, and there will be a massive loss of coral reefs at 1.3 degrees C. So this is really bad, because the coral reefs are just dying before our very eyes, and we've known about this for so, so long. The balance of nature. When I was a boy growing up in England, like the balance of nature was like the law. I suppose I should point out I grew up in the country, and people were very, very apprehensive about doing big things to the environment or forest because they would say, well, what about the balance of nature? Well, of course, we've lost that idea completely. And we are completely out of balance with nature. And we've got to put that right first before we can stop the destruction that we're bringing about, or our economy and driven by our governments bringing about. With respect to that, the big thing, which I wasn't aware of how big it was until one of my friends in California told me, is the world fisheries. The world fisheries has expanded massively. And now the world fishery catches 90 million tons of fish. So they take 90 million tons of fish out of the ocean. Do you think that's not going to have an effect? Oh my God. And then there's the bycatch. They throw away just as much, if not even more. So my friend told me about the Chinese fishery fleet, and it is an armada. It is a massive fleet of massive boats. That's just one country. So it's one of the reasons why actually I became a vegan years ago, because I saw what was happening to the fisheries. So bear that in mind, everybody. The fish are really important. They're also very important, by the way, because they're part of that carbon sink in the oceans. So the oceans, of course, is the biggest carbon sink by far, orders of magnitude bigger than any other sinks. When we take that amount of fish out, that's a major disturbance to the carbon sink, right? Because those fish normally will die and go to the bottom of the ocean, and carbon will become part of the sediment. Back to blue carbon. I was fascinated by the fact that really most of the discussion that I could find was on the economic aspects of blue carbon. What blue carbon, how valuable it was, how we could develop and had to develop faster a blue carbon market. I was very apprehensive about that because it seems when market mechanisms get into play, things don't get better; they tend to get worse. Seagrass is absolutely astounding, and apparently you're right because Regina, because I was shocked to see the rate of decline of seagrass. In some regions, just in the past 15 years, supposedly 25% seagrass has gone. These numbers, actually, I'm not sure. They're hard to believe, but they're huge. So just a sort of rule of thumb, I found that global kelp is declining 2% every year. 2% every year is massive, massive. Also, mangroves are very similar. 30% of the mangroves have been lost just in the past 20 years, you know, according to what I was reading. Anyway, I worked out mangroves are going down by about 2% a year, if not more, 2 to 3% per year. That also is massive. Yeah, you're so right. We cannot afford this rate of loss because we are completely dependent. Human species is one of the things about the human species is we are totally dependent on other species. Absolutely. So if we're going to have any life in the future, we really got to stop this. And that's very difficult because governments don't have the power to regulate or implement regulations anymore as they used to just 20 so years ago. The corporations have totally taken over. And of course, these big fisheries are private corporations or in some cases, national corporations. It's completely gotten out of hand. And I'm so glad that we brought this topic up because people really, I don't think, are aware of the devastation that what we call our industries are doing to the ocean. And the seagrasses and the kelp and the mangroves, they are part of this loss. And there's all kinds of reasons where we're getting marine heat waves. They're lasting longer, right? They're more widely distributed. But we're also getting deep ocean marine heat waves, which last even longer than the marine ones. So we got to stop it and put things right again. And we have to get into some balance with nature.
Thank you, Peter. It's definitely incumbent upon us to get in balance with nature. I really liked that you used that word that is that infamous and hideous word, bycatch. When these big, long trawlers, these ships that just comb the sea for fish and just throw out whatever it is that's not marketable. Sea turtles, all kinds of beautiful creatures that are essentially dead by then, and they just throw them off the side of the ship. Or it's a terrible, terrible thing to call anything that lives bycatch. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me, the rapacious greed of these fishing industries. And of course, we've done shows on that as well. And I think it's a very good reason to go vegan or vegetarian, not eating any animals. And the thing is once again, because we've polluted the ocean so much, it's healthier not to eat these animals, especially fish, because it's loaded with microplastics. God only knows how much plastic we eat in a day, much less a month and a year. So it's best to avoid it anyway. It's just a shame. And the thing of it is these 4 habitats that we've spoken of bring so much to this beautiful ocean, and to see them in decline is really a travesty. Paul, do you have anything else to share with us, whether of your scuba diving adventures or other thoughts on these habitats?
Thanks, Regina, and thank you, Peter. Yeah, I was very, very fortunate to get a chance to scuba dive on these kelp forests. This would have been 1988 or 89. I hadn't had my license for too long, and I was down, above the depth of sport diving, which is normally 33, 40 feet. I was, you have to go down about 100 feet where the kelp is anchored to the seafloor. And it's literally like you're in a forest, you're in a marine forest. And I remember clearly a black object hurtling towards us at one point in this forest. And what I quickly did the sensible thing and swam behind my buddy so that he was in line. And it was this massive sea lion or seal. Of course, your brain says shark right away, especially in waters off the California coast. So, little would I have realized that these forests actually that I dove on are no longer there. They're part of the California, Monterey, Carmel sort of systems where, these kelp forests have basically just been pulverized and eliminated by the purple sea urchins. And I talked about the chain of ecological catastrophes that can lead to that happening. It's like, the dependency of one species on another is the way of the world, basically, and it can be very fragile and be disrupted very quickly by things that we don't expect happening. So, it's like clear cutting the underwater forest in a way. If this happens on land, you can have a lot of people seeing the signs of it and stopping it, but it's under the ocean, so not many people are going to see it in person, are going to dive down and see it. So people are have been less aware of ecological catastrophes in the oceans deep down, out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. But like I said, these are enormous carbon sinks, and there are groups that are doing a lot of work trying to restore kelp beds, particularly off California. The Nature Conservancy comes to mind. They send out drones and look at satellite image, and you can actually detect the green smudges on the satellite images of where the kelp forests are. There's a great website, kelpwatch.org, which allows you to monitor things. And the United Nations Environmental Program has some great resources on their website. We'll put the links to on all of these four topics, the corals, the seagrasses, the kelp, and the mangroves. And most people around the world are aware of what's happening with the coral reefs, but I would say that the decimation of the kelp is much further ahead. It's much graver. There is some work being done to try to grow kelp near shore regions to try to find out, there's about 100 species of kelp. I mean, it's basically brown algae. There's work being done to try to find out the most resilient types of kelp and to try to get rid of those purple sea urchins on the ocean floor, try to reestablish kelp beds where they were before. So there is some work being done on that side, but most important thing is to be aware of the stresses to these underwater places, which most people aren't aware of.
Thank you so much for pointing that out, Paul. I mean, there's so many things that we do see, the degradation of the planet, the loss of species that we do nothing about, but absolutely out of sight, out of mind. So when it's, this is part of the human condition. When you are unable to see what's wrong, it's hard to correct for it.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of the old timer divers in California. They don't dive anymore because it's too depressing. Right? They used to be able to dive just off their coasts and go out in a boat, go a couple miles offshore, dive on a kelp bed, but there's nothing there. It's up to the young people to document the destruction because the old timers stay away from it. They say we can't go and do it anymore. It's totally different from what it was when we were younger. Yeah, it's a huge sense of loss, right? It really gets to people how we're actually, you don't have to move to experience a different place. You just have to stay where you are, and you can see the degradation of nature around you, wherever you are on the planet.
That is so true. And I think it's another reason why it's very important for people to put down the phones, put down the devices, and look around, see what's going on around you. When we are constantly with phones in the face, there's so many negative impacts, but of course, being divorced from reality, being divorced from the world around us is a biggie. It's very important to maintain awareness and to appreciate what we have in the here and now. What we have in the here and now is much more important than a few lighted pixels on a screen. Peter, do you want to close us out here with your thoughts?
So yeah, I guess my final thought would be policy, because that's my main experience, and I'm reminded that the 1992 United Nations Framework Climate Change Convention, which was and is actually a great convention, far stronger than any of the others, is being totally disrespected. There were two main parts, of course, to it. Obviously, one was that nations would control their greenhouse gas emissions so as to keep atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations in safe limits. 350 was determined. It's been recently confirmed as a safe limit, and now we're up to 420 odd, and going up faster than ever. But the other part of the convention, nations agreed, and they're required, it's legally binding. The 92 convention is legally binding. They're required to protect their carbon sinks. So what are we doing? Of course, we've just explained the tragic fact that we're destroying the carbon sinks. And the attention should not, as I say, be on blue carbon and the economics. It's not going to help. We got to stop destruction. And particularly, we've got to stop, because nature has resilience, true, and it can restore, true. But you have to rely on nature restoring herself. We can't restore nature without allowing nature to self-restore. It will not happen. So that would be my final word. And I really appreciate Paul mentioning actually all those great citizen groups who understand this, and there's not nearly enough of them, but they are doing great work.
Agree so much with you, Peter. And it is really important to work with groups, find people who have the same passions and cares as you about the planet, look for the solution, look for the positive things. And of course, that does not mean negating the things that are really happening. For example, when Paul spoke to the issue of divers who can no longer dive because they just can't stand to bear witness to the devastation, there is that truth. That's not going anywhere. But I think it is very important to try to focus on the things that we can do, even if that means just making a few friends who, we can talk to about our feelings about what's going on with the planet. Because without hope, it's really impossible to maintain the stamina needed for the very important work that we need to do as citizens and of carers of this planet. Now, I know that Paul spoke to all of these habitats are under threat. And of course, I really appreciate hearing about the kelp forests. And I love so many of the animals that live among them very much. I do want to just give a final shout out for the coral reefs, simply because they are less than 1% of the ocean floor, but home to more than 25% of marine life. It takes a long time for a coral reef to become established, very long time, anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 years, depending upon the type of reef. But it doesn't take that long to destroy it. Very fragile, very easy to destroy. So it's important that we consider the mangroves, the kelp forests, the underwater seagrass meadows, and of course, the coral reefs. Very, very important to all living beings on planet Earth. And you, our audience, are also very important. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. So I really want to take this time to thank you for staying through to the end of this show. I hope you found this one interesting. If there were any aspects that you feel that we left out of the show, please let us know in the discussion. And if this is your first time and you enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up. And whether it's your first time or your 20th time, please like, share, and most of all, subscribe. We'd love for you to become part of the Climate Emergency Forum family. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.